Alright goobers, let's talk about Ken and his XM190, a vehicle that has been flying under a lot of people's radar as the vehicle definitely feels a bit sluggish when you first use it without any upgrades. But once you start getting upgrades, this vehicle feels very nice to use, has a lot of variety in its builds, and overall gets a lot better the more you progress with it. Let's go over the modules for the XM190. The first module slot is super versatile as you have the options for smoke rounds, HESH, heat, ATGMs. And some of these options are not worth it, especially after the recent nerfs, specifically ATGMs. The reload on them is now too slow for the upsides they have, which comes in slightly more damage than heat and a better crit cone. If the damage of these was buffed to around 650 to 560, they might be worthwhile, especially with the crit cone that they have. When it comes to smokes, they are a good way for creating a safe passage to get onto a cap or smoking out snipers, and the reload buff on the base shells are helpful. However, they are not the greatest for getting high score games as they can deal damage, but the blast radius is nowhere near as good as the base high explosive, and the ballistic drop is the highest of all the shell options for the XM190. The canister rounds are really situational. Sometimes they can be great, but if you're even 5 meters away from a target, they do lose a bunch of penetration, and you struggle even to penetrate the rear of the chopper's M1E1, as seen here. But there are situations where you can do crazy damage if you're able to sneak past the enemies. But even then, you have to get right up behind the targets. On that note, though, the other two rounds that are available are great rounds. The upgraded HESH and heat. HESH is very versatile. It makes it when you track an enemy, they have to take 2 extra seconds to repair if they do not use their repair kit. And another thing to mention with the HESH upgrade is that 2 rounds will completely strip any vehicles of all of its shields. This helps when flanking enemies as you can strip their shields and then track them in order to get their sides and rear and easily crit them for full damage since they no longer have any shields to soak up that crit damage. One thing that should be noted when using HESH is that it does have ballistic drop, though it's not as bad as smoke rounds, but more than heat. I prefer using HESH due to its versatility and the fact that when you strip shields it gives XP. This allows for higher XP games. And then the final round I want to talk about is heat. It is a bit weaker than it was before the nerfs, but is still a good option even with the increased energy cost, especially if you're running Kritzkrieg, as the crit cone is really good if you penetrate a vehicle and allows you to crit some weak spots that you can't do with normal rounds. And this also helps being more consistent with scoring critical hits against enemies. Overall, the first module, I will swap between the HESH and heat rounds, but I do prefer using HESH. For the second module, I personally keep it empty. However, there is a module that if you have the payload to take can be good, such as Ward Against Harm for the warded effect while within the probe's radius. I should mention, if you are running the smoke build on the XM190, Infinity Ward is also a good choice to help identify enemies in your smoke. For the first firepower slot, there are a few options here that are worthwhile for early builds. You can take the robotic autoloading system. This allows you when fully stacked to have a 1-second reload. This helps when you run out of one ammo type as it reduces the swap time for the ability as well. I also did test this module with smoke rounds, and it seems the lowest reload is only 1 second, so you cannot go lower than this 1 second reload. Boiling Vessel is also another okay early module as it helps with the restock time for 10 seconds after each kill, which can help getting both ammo types back faster, and the energy can help as well after each kill, especially if you are consistently running out of energy. TOGS is really only ever an option if you're running the smoke build for the thermals. The enlarged gun breach is also a good module to run later, as you don't really notice the armor reduction and the reticle size increase is also not an issue. I don't find myself sniping often, and even when I do, I can still hit my shots. The passive on this mod applies after the 4th shot, and unfortunately it does not apply the damage to the rounds from your ability. However, your abilities will stack the damage for your base rounds. This is one of the reasons why Hesh is a good take, as the stack is only added if you deal damage to the enemy, and if you don't deal damage, the timer starts to go down. This allows you to get 500 base damage on your standard rounds, and allows for up to 1200 damage on ammo crits. Though I do feel like this module still needs some work, as the stacks seem to fall off too fast. And in that sense, Kritzkrieg can be the better option for the majority of people, as the extra crit cone angle is a good thing to have, as well as the cone length. The debuffs for Kritzkrieg are a bit harsh. However, it is made up by the passive, which whenever you get a crit will restock a round in the autoloader. However, this will only restock the base magazine and not the rounds for your ability. For the second firepower mod, there are also some good options here. Hydrodynamic bearing in general is not a good mod to take, as the turret traverse on this vehicle is already really good, and the minus 25% turret ring armor thickness is a really bad trade-off. Nitramine is theoretically good. The only issue is that you don't tend to find yourself sniping too often for the increased shell speed to be worthwhile, and the 5% increased pen power is not high enough as well. For early modules, tungsten alloy is a solid choice to take, as it's about half the stats of depleted uranium without the debuffs and fire status effect. The combat stimulants is another decent early choice for 10% increased reload speed and 5% increased damage, and could be a good pairing with enlarged gun breach. However, since it doesn't stack, I decided it was not a module for me specifically. I did also test telescope munition, and it does seem to be an okay choice early on for the boost in fire rate, especially for close range engagements. The only issue with it is you drop off a lot of your mid to long range performance. Memento Mori is another decent mod, as it applies fragility on every shot against enemies for 10 seconds, stacking up to 37.5% extra crit damage against the enemy, which anyone on your team can take advantage of. However, where this mod shines is if you find yourself in squads a lot, specifically if one of your squad members runs a support vehicle such as Blitz or the Bat-4M, as the reduced health on the repair kits is a big blow, and if you decide to take this mod, it is actually better to run the small repair kits instead of the large repair kits, as well as Dorchester armor for the increased survivability that you lose from the reduced repair kit heal. The final mod, Depleted Uranium, is a stronger version of Tungsten Alloy with 2 new passives. One that allows you to inflict burning status on enemies after 5 shots, which is helpful against enemies that you can't frontally crit, such as the Reaper's M60 or when face-hugging a chopper M1E1. However, you will have to be more careful when fighting to not expose your ammo rack, as the radiation status effects will prevent you from healing and does about 50 tick damage per second for 5 seconds. When running this mod, the Tusk upgrade can be a decent mod pick up. For the speed modules, there are another couple of decent modules to run. Graphite Lubricant is the most lackluster, but the engine power can definitely help out. However, for early modules, Adrenaline High can be good, as it can be purchased with faction tokens when you don't have enough soft currency, as it grants Hasted on Kill, which is a really nice effect to have when you assassinate someone and want to get out of dodge, and the increased stamina regen also aids you in getting out of dodge as well. Another good early module is Kerosene Fuels, which is a smaller version of the legendary with the +5 to top speed, which allows you to go up to 60 on flat ground and 70 when sprinting, and doesn't have as high crit multiplier against your fuel tanks with 10% instead of 15% damage increase, as well as not having the increased engine crit multiplier altogether, which makes it a good pickup if you're struggling with the speed of the XM190, and is a good option if you want to save some payload energy at full build. For the other modules, Evasive Smoke is a decent pickup if you're specifically going the smoke build, as it allows for you to produce even more smoke, but unless that is your goal, it's not worthwhile of a module to take. The Supercharger is a very situational choice, as it does help with the slow sprint recharge time, though you still are better off taking Kerosene. The torsion bars are decent only if you're running Dorchester armor, as it allows you to actually turn your hull properly when you're at low speeds. Regardless though, you're again better off taking Kerosene or specifically the gas turbine engine for the +10 to forward speed and +5 to reverse speed, which allows you to go 65 on flat ground and 77 to 78 when sprinting, and also allows you to go 35 in reverse and up to 40 when sprinting in reverse. The increased crit and fuel multipliers and fire duration can be partially mitigated with the self-sealing fuel tank. Speaking of which, self-sealing fuel tanks is one of the best modules to have for this vehicle, as it helps mitigate a lot of debuffs of the previous modules with its 10% crit reduction to fuel tanks and its minus 50% to fire duration, and is my preferred choice of module. Another decent cheap module is Reinforced Optics. It's not a bad option if you find yourself in a lot of hold down situations, as it increases the armor of your optic weak point from 120 all the way up to 326. To be fair though, this is one of the modules that I haven't tested enough to see if it's really worth it, and I still prefer self-sealing fuel tanks. Another decent early module for this slot is Chobham Armor, as it can also be purchased from the vendor and gives 12.5 increased HP for a total of 3,150. However, if getting tanky is your priority, it is overall a worse module than Dorchester Armor, as it has almost identical debuffs for less HP. When it comes to the Tusk upgrade package, it's a decent choice if you're using depleted uranium rounds, as it helps mitigate ammo racks versus people with odd angles to you. However, it won't stop people from ammo racking you. If they have your rear or the flat side of your turret, it's still an easy penetration. And it's not the best option, but it does help. And finally, the last module, Dorchester Armor, the arguably better version of Chobham Armor with the same first, second, and third gear power debuff, and an extra minus 2.5% traverse speed for a total of minus 10% traverse speed, and a debuff to sprint in low gears. After testing this module, when you are in low gears, you really feel that lowered traverse speed, which is why torsion suspension isn't the worst option to have in the speed module. However, when you get up to speed, you are still just as fast, which is why I still prefer using the gas turbine engine, and the sprint debuff doesn't seem to be particularly bad, as you can still hit top speed with half of your sprint bar remaining, and Dorchester Armor does give you 3,500 total HP. When talking about playstyle of this vehicle, it is definitely an aggressive flanker where you get into the enemy's face and it has the tools available to get around them and unleash your shots into their sides and rear, especially when running the speed mods on this vehicle. And if you're running the health mods instead, it definitely feels more like a sluggish brawler, killing enemies that decide to sit in front of you for too long with your high base DPM. This vehicle is very rewarding to use, especially when you can catch an enemy by surprise with your damage, or even with the shell type you are using, as the right shell in the right situation can always change the flow of the battle. I will say that not being able to boost when using your secondary shell type can be challenging to deal with, as you have to actively switch shells depending on what the situation calls for. In some cases, that could be switching off your ability shell in order to boost an enemy to get closer to them, or even get around them. It should be noted that Kent's XM190's other two abilities, I tend not to use them as much. The Recon Probe is very situational and does have a high base energy cost, making me less likely to use it, as it could limit how many secondary shells I can get off. And the Ultimate can be decent in the right situation. However, I find myself holding on to it for too long, as either it does not have the range to lock on to all the targets that I want it to, or there aren't enough targets in front of me to warrant using it. But it can be a decent choice for engaging on a solitary target, especially if you are able to lock them down in a spot after using it. I hope this video was able to help you with deciding if the XM190 is a vehicle for you.
Condition.